Hello, everybody, and welcome to this installment of Azure Cloud Talk. I'm one of your hosts, Alec Harrison, here with kind of an impromptu, just like off the cuff episode, just with some scheduling. I think having Brian and I together didn't quite work out while we were discussing some other things and kind of what we're working on. So, with this episode, I've been really excited to kind of go over .NET Conf just happened. Microsoft Ignite's coming up. I'm seeing a lot of MVPs and other people in the Microsoft ecosystem kind of getting excited and prepared to go to that. So I think it's a great event. Make sure if you can get up there, that's awesome. If not, a lot of this stuff is going to be virtual. So if you feel any FOMO or like you're missing out, make sure you follow Microsoft Ignite online because you can go ahead and be a part of the party, see the announcements pretty much at the same time as everybody there in person, and just generally be a part of the conversation. With that, I want to kind of come over all the announcements or some of the big highlights that I felt were really cool in .NET Conf this year. So, one thing, shout out to the Omaha .NET user group. They usually host a big party. We had it at Qt this year, and where we all get together for day one of .NET Conf and kind of just sit around a table, see what all's going on, and kind of learn about that. So it's cool sense of community. Q would also provide us all with lunch and some breakfast. So it was fun to kind of meet up with community members and do something a little bit different, right? Versus, we all show up, sit around, chat, um, all that sort of stuff. So I'm going to start from the top. If you are following along, or if you want to check this out yourself, you can actually just search the dev blogs on Microsoft for .NET Conf. They have all of the uh, basically the sessions or the agenda of what happened. I'm just going to go down the list. If there's anything you are super excited about, a lot of this content is recorded, so you can always check it out later. But I'm just going to kind of touch on what I found really cool and exciting. So I think first and foremost, one of the biggest things that I love to use in .NET, Azure, any sort of thing to help with like both my APIM definition, as well as just like not having to write middleware. So um, using a tool like Swagger OpenAI, right? I can go and do my endpoint definition. I don't have to then generate or write that middleware of, here's the HTTP call, here's the model that it's expecting, here's the model it's returning, yada, yada, so on and so forth. With Swagger and OpenAI CodeGen or OpenAPI CodeGen, you can generate a lot of that. One problem is I think that library isn't quite up to being maintained or isn't quite as active as they would like to see. So a part of .NET 9 is Microsoft's actually building an OpenAI API, OpenAI, OpenAPI. Then you have open logging too. Sorry, a little bit of a tongue twister, brain bend there. But we'll be able to generate open API documents with a Microsoft package. So that means one less third-party package potentially, and it'll be a Microsoft ASP.NET Core OpenAI package. You can bring it in. It looks very similar to how you bring in the package already. So I wouldn't be super freaked out about it. The endpoint that it goes to by default is a little bit different, but that was always fully customizable. So as far as day in and day out, from what I see is Microsoft taking a more active step to make sure that this package continues to live on, be monitored, maintained, all that sort of stuff. Uh, I hope it continues to be as open source as it has been. That way, if there's people in the community who want to step in and help maintain it, they can. But uh, I'm really excited to see kind of what other features or other things that with a team that is paid to maintain it can potentially help roll out or introduce. So I think that's really cool. I'm pretty excited about that. And why that also matters too is when you're talking, since this is an Azure podcast, your API in the cloud, you then have an API spec for API management. So if you want to use APIM, you now can say, okay, here's what's my API does, so on and so forth. So when you need to start potentially provisioning those around, moving things around, or just in general managing your API, you can do that. Super cool tool. I think it's super underrated. There's people I know who Haven't used it before, and that's my biggest thing is whenever I'm telling people about my ideal, if I'm gonna play the ivory tower architect, Open API and Swagger CodeGen, greatest things ever, because then you don't have to write your middleware, and then if you're allowing the code to be auto-generated, you theoretically shouldn't have to test it either, because the code shouldn't change much or change to have breaking changes in it. So then you're truly just writing your presentation layer, on your front end. So however you're going to present it, your component, whatnot, and then you're writing the API, but you don't have to write that middleware connector piece that, for the most part in a lot of systems are very similar. Sometimes it's error prone as you copy a model from one place to another. You potentially then have duplicate definitions. You have to make sure if you update one, you update the other. Where if you're just doing auto gen and your source of truth is the API's definition, you don't have to deal with that. It's just, you have one source of truth. It's there. It's done. So 10 out of 10 would recommend digging into that if you haven't already. The other thing is the Microsoft Extensions.ai preview. So it's helping to basically unify and make building AI models easier. They touched on this quite a few times. So I'm kind of curious as to seeing what that looks like. Oop, I was going to try to put the banner. There we go. So here's the URL. It is DevBlogs introducing Microsoft Extensions AI preview. If you just search Microsoft Extensions, you'll find it pretty easily. What I think this is really cool with and unique is we're kind of moving away from the fact of like you have your basic CRUD APIs for AI, right? So just I'm going to call Azure OpenAI. Maybe I use the SDK, but for the most part, I'm kind of limited in the runway of what I can do. Like I'm gonna have to start building out functionalities, or I'm gonna have to eventually graduate to a more complex system like your semantic kernel, those kind of tools. Where I'm hoping this is, and what I'm kind of seeing is it's a unified API, so we can call multiple models, right? So I don't have to then go and say, "Hey, I'm calling OpenAI. I'm calling my OLlama or my Llama instance that is hosted in Azure." I now have a unified API that works for all models hosted in Azure. So that's really nice. Um, and then it should hopefully allow me to drop in easier consumptions of different models. So I don't have to go and graduate. So I don't have to build the full HTTP layer of, all right, here's the API call to Azure OpenAI. Here's the response that comes back. Let me parse it out, change with all that. I can just say, okay, I'm going to call this model, and I have a unified way to interact with all of that. So I think that's really cool and help ease the burden of getting into AI. And I'm hoping that also means as they continue with this kind of pattern, they'll continue to build out more and more features, is what I'm excited for. So you can maybe continue to do AI development without having to potentially graduate to something more complicated like a semantic kernel, that next step into AI or generative AI specifically of, hey, this is a little harder. It's going to take a little bit more work on my end when really we're just still trying to keep some more basic features. For example, like one limitation I found with just calling Azure OpenAI is if you're trying to do math or calculations, say, for example, I have a data source, right? I'm using RAG. I want to ask how many elements are in this table. RAG is really great at finding a specific answer if you have it. The thing it's not so great at is saying there is like 52 elements in your table. So that's where one point I've seen where you kind of have that graduation to semantic kernel of you need to like write your query, have that execute, come back, so on and so forth, where maybe as something like this continues to build out, we can get more functionality and flexibility instead of having to then graduate to something more complex. So that's something I'm really excited about continuing to follow that along, see how that works, and obviously how that plays into Azure. You want to use OpenAI, you want to use AI at all. If Azure is your API provider for AI, now you can integrate it. The next thing is .NET Aspire for Azure Functions is now in preview. What that means is we can now start using OpenTelemetry and different tools like that in our Azure Functions. So that's really cool. We can configure different health checks and have just kind of a higher level of governance. So if you were going to use .NET Aspire for all of your other apps where you have, some baseline, if you go to um, the default methods or, default logging, health check, all that, you can now start rolling some of those defaults into your Azure functions. So it's really cool to see that we can get some of those reports, diagnostics, all that sort of stuff that comes out of .NET Aspire as well. .NET Aspire 2 is another tool I plan to do a deeper dive on. I think we had a pretty good listener poll when Scott Sauber from Lean Techniques, who happens to be my boss, joined us and kind of gave the 411 of what the heck even is .NET Aspire. I think it'd be interesting to have him come back as like maybe a part 2, or as we continue to use it to see where it maybe fits in, where maybe there's some room to be desired, or maybe there's like other um, use cases or benefits that aren't really super prevalent until you start using it and building with it. So TBD on that. We'll see if we can find Scott or maybe somebody else to talk about that. Performance improvements in .NET 9 is crazy. I think I saw one metric up to like a 90% improvement. I don't know if that was just a random screenshot on the internet or for real, but I think the takeaway is it is drastically quicker on most things. So more performant and quicker. What that means to you is we can continue to, if you're like me, use as much free tier stuff in Azure as humanly possible, pay them as little bit as money as possible, so you can really maximize your cost for performance of being in the cloud. Um, I think that's really awesome. That's really great. We can continue to build with worse and worse machines, or maybe not as powerful if we're doing local development. Um, I don't know if we're quite gone the days of the dev machine, but it would be really cool to, have a Raspberry Pi be able to run a really complex application. And I'm sure some are, depending on how simple they are. But I think just in general, we're seeing a huge performance uptick of how performant .NET 9 is. So if you're running into some performance issues, might be good to jump into .NET 9 and kind of see how that goes out. .NET 9 is also not the LTS version. We've talked about that a little bit. It is the current version, but it's not going to be the long-term support version. So if you're new-ish to the .NET kind of support world, what they tend to do is they do a long-term release or long-term support and a LTS, and I'm going to blank on the exact verbiage of the other one, but it's just basically they don't plan to support it as long. So that is going to be the kind of the differences. So if you're going to be there for the long term and you don't like to update your stuff, maybe .NET 9 is one you skip. But if you're trying to get the latest and greatest of all the improvements and whatnot, definitely jump over there and see how that works. And it's always, in my opinion, easier to go, sequentially up when you do upgrades instead of having to skip versions or go double. Granted, ever since we moved to the latest .NET naming convention, so .NET, was it 5 or 6? Basically, since we got out of cores, it's been pretty seamless to update between different versions. So the pain has been a lot less, but I'll always sign up for less pain than more if I can help it. Then there was some GitHub updates. So they kind of showed off how GitHub Copilot works in Visual Studio. A great tool if you haven't used it before. Helps developers be more productive for not a lot of money. I've seen numbers as wild as something like 20 or 30% more productive. I've seen some more realistic numbers or estimations about 10 to 15% more productive, which, if you think about it, a tool that costs $30 a month, the worst case, I think there's ways, if you're a big enough organization, that definitely check into. But worst case, $30 a month per developer is going to be $360 a year. If you're talking, I know the area I'm in, a entry level developer fresh out of college is probably making anywhere from 50 to 70K. So if you're talking paying $360 for essentially a 5,000 to 7,000 on the low end. If we're talking a 10% improvement, like the ROI seems to be there to continue to help people. What I found personally is really great because you just stay in the flow state. You don't have to leave your IDE. Um, One downside is I don't think JetBrains Writer is supported yet, which is the IDE of my choice for my Mac, but Visual Studio Code is, and that is for right now my front end development environment of choice. I'm starting to get into Cursor, so I'm sure I'll report back on that. Cursor AI's IDE, but for right now, I'd say my kind of dual or IDEs of choice is uh, Writer and then Visual Studio Code for front end stuff because then I can use my Copilot. Or if there's any language that I'm not super familiar with, I tend to use Visual Studio Code just so I can have GitHub Copilot help me. Great tool. Would recommend. They also talk about some other things of what GitHub is doing to integrate with .NET specifically. So you should check out that video if that interests you at all. It's pretty cool. They also then talked about scrolling through the list, building hybrid apps in .NET MAUI. That's really cool if you're trying to do some cross-platform stuff. For example, if you want to build a native Android app, native iOS, so on and so forth, you can do that. Yeah, it's a great tool. It has a lot of positivity. Kind of replaced Xamarin. So if you're familiar with Xamarin, I believe that's the new latest and greatest from there. The .NET Aspire roadmap, they kind of talked about that too. So if you want to see where that's going and maybe the new features that are coming out of there, one thing that is cool, I know it's a .NET or it's an Azure Talk. We're talking about .NET stuff. Aspire is actually trying to be cloud agnostic as well. So they actually integrate with the AWS CDK pretty well. So if you're even in Azure or AWS land, I've done some Amazon work. Like that's actually where I started cutting my teeth. So um, I understand, this is an Azure podcast. I'm a Microsoft MVP. Azure's great. Some organizations don't give you the flexibility of choosing your cloud, right? Like you come in, no matter what level you're at, and they just might say, you know what? Amazon is the company we did work with. We signed the agreement. You're not going to be able to use Azure, period. So if that's you, there is some awesome stuff with .NET Aspire and AWS going on. So check it out. You can totally do that and hopefully join the party. Don't feel left out doing .NET on AWS. And yeah, I think at a high level, that's kind of what we have for this episode. They also talk about some .NET Aspire integration. So if you want to integrate your own stuff in there, you can do that. It's really cool. Would totally check that out. If you don't have, or if you have some free time or want to check it out, make sure you check out the .NET Conf website of everything that goes on. I'm pretty sure if you check it out, that most of this stuff was live streamed. So a lot of it you can still find now after the fact. Just to celebrate the release of .NET 9 or just search .NET Conf 2024 and the agenda should be somewhere you should be able to find it. But yeah, with that, I think this is kind of wrapping up what I'm excited about. I'm going to start digging into some of these things, maybe blogging a few more, doing all that sort of fun stuff. But I'm also working on potentially a newsletter. So if you have any sort of questions you'd like answered, I'm trying to aim at from a C-suite level all the way down to a developer level. So trying to get some content for everybody. And hoping to start that on a weekly basis once that gets all wired up and knocked out. But if you have any content or questions about anything, feel free to reach out. It can be like, why would you use AI organization to maybe some strategic, like we were talking about, a little bit of numbers. with the GitHub Copilot. Uh, you know, why would I use that as a C-suite? Why do I care as a developer? Maybe there's tips and tricks as a developer. 365 Copilot, you're kind of blending the line of everybody. We can talk about some of that too. So if you have any questions that you'd love answered, feel free to reach out, comment on this feed where you see it, or message me on LinkedIn. I'll either put it in the newsletter, get you the answer, or I could even potentially find somebody who would know the answer if I don't. With that, I want to say thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week. Bye, everybody.